Our next speaker is Mike Penrose, Executive Director of UNICEF in the UK, and he's going to be speaking to us about aid, trade, and emerging markets.
Thank you, Sam. And I'm afraid you're getting subject to the Penrose hour, it appears, because you had John Penrose, the self-avowed Mrs. Penrose, and my name's Mike Penrose. I'm the Executive Director of UNICEF here in the UK. That's okay, no problem. There's enough Penroses in here already. So. The point I'm hoping to make very much here is that investment in aid and investment overseas and in development isn't how very much the arguments are being put forward at the moment. It isn't either a do-gooding, bleeding heart thing we should do because it represents Britain well in the world. And it isn't also because... and we have some supporters in some very strange places as well. It isn't also because it's good for peace, security and development. It's incredibly good for peace, security and development. And one of our most recent supporters was, ironically, General Mad Dog Mathis in the US, the military advisor to the US government and to Donald Trump, who said directly to the president, if you cut the aid budget, you better just use the money to spend it on ammunition because I'm damn well going to need it. All of these facts are true, but I also believe very, very strongly that an investment, good investment, and there's some suggestions on changes we need to make, good investment in aid is a good investment in our economy. It's a good investment for the future of Britain. And we heard a lot, actually, with the Prime Minister's speech. I think she said it 3 times, where Britain hopes to be a strong trading nation. It hopes to be a nation with strong defence cooperation. And we're proud of our extensive defence, security and development engagement with the world. And she said that 3 times. And that's just mimicking Woodrow Wilson from quite a while back in the US, who said that there are 3 key elements to foreign policy that create a stable world with which the US wants to trade. And that's defence, diplomacy and development. Now, the economic reasons for that is, and it's actually segueing very well from the last presentation, because developing nations have enormous skills gaps, because they have enormous gaps, emerging nations and developing nations, in the amount of money they have to spend on skills, education, and a healthy population, they're ending up with an enormous trade imbalance. Far greater than ours, and also an enormous imbalance in skills that mean that they are becoming increasingly unable to engage with the world as it is today. And the truth about the British economy, and all the rhetoric we're hearing around Brexit about our ability to trade with the world now and sign trade deals with the world all over, is dependent on the fact that people will want to buy what we have to sell. And the truth is, we don't make buckets and flip-flops and blankets and pots and pans anymore. China does that. Southeast Asia does that. We sell top-end engineering. We sell biotech. We sell chips. We sell high-end financial services. We don't sell the type of products that the majority of the world still consume the most at the moment. And if we're going to engage with economies that are able to buy our products in the future, we're going to have to help them get to the point where they can afford them. And it's only by bridging that imbalance, that trade imbalance, using bilateral aid, well-applied bilateral aid, that supports governments to prop up a little bit their technological deficit at the moment, prop up a little bit their economy at the moment, so they can spend the money that they have, the small amount of money they have, tackling the root cause of the inequality and the deficit at the moment, which has led to the problems they have. And that root cause is the anchor that's weighing them down at the moment. And that's a lot of the social issues they face. The biggest social issues they face at the moment are undernutrition. Bill Gates was cornered coming out of the UN General Assembly a while ago and said, Mr. Gates, if there was one problem you could solve in the world today, what would it be? And he said, undernutrition. Undernutrition is the biggest problem because a stunted child, a child who has been chronically malnourished for a very long period of time, loses 20% of their intellectual capacity. And that's permanent. That will never be undone again. A child, and the largest causes of undernutrition, in children especially, are things like acute watery diarrhea and pneumonia, which are caused by poor water and sanitation. On top of that, in a lot of economies, very, very large numbers of children are out of school at any given time and will never catch that up. And if you put all those elements together, children that are unable to learn, children that are not in school, and children that have a very, very high chance of either low mortality or high levels of morbidity when they're young, you have an anchor on an economy. And I think the best example that exists in the world today is Indonesia. Indonesia, in a post-Brexit Britain, should be exactly the target state that we want to do business with. It is the 17th largest economy in the world at the moment, scheduled by 2030 to be the 7th. It's the fastest growing and largest economy in Asia at the moment, and 60% of all projected economic growth in the future will come from Asia. This is an economy at the moment that is predicting to spend something like, I've got the number here actually, 74 billion in the next few years on public-private partnership type infrastructure projects that will help it address some of the deficits that we've been talking about before. And that's exactly the type of projects that our industries can engage with and can help an if bilateral aid is spent well, can help economies like Indonesia tackle that deficit. But at the same time, Indonesia has 87 million people who are food insecure today. 87 million people who don't know where their next meal is coming from. They have the third highest burden in the world of undernutrition. 1 in 3 children in Indonesia are malnourished. Now, you have an economy that is growing dramatically but starting to taper off slightly because there is not enough young people coming up who can fill the skills gap needed to continue to grow in the type of digital world that was very well described previously. On top of that, you have about 20% of Indonesian children who are not in school. Australia engages very well with its aid program, as does the US in Indonesia at the moment, in applying not only bilateral aid in helping support the economy bridge that gap, but also heavy investment in the education infrastructure to overcome it. So does the UK and so does the EU. This is exactly the type of investment that will recreate a market of hundreds of millions of people who in the future will want to buy high-end financial services, will be in the market for tech. And one of our biggest partners for exactly this reason, one of our single largest financial partners, is a UK company called Arm. I don't know if many of you know Arm Holdings, but those who do, every single mobile phone that you own has their technology in it. They were recently bought by SoftBank in Japan for 40-something billion pounds, an enormous sum of money. They partner with us because they say that their biggest single problem at the moment is that skills gap in the developing world, and they're starting to bump up against their ability to trade with these countries. Now, organizations like UNICEF are the best in the world, and our partners are tackling those root cause issues. And that's where international aid can be applied very, very effectively in terms of tackling the long-term systemic problems that are going to prevent countries in the future being able to trade with us. And effective bilateral aid, when applied with proper scrutiny and proper governance, is the best in the short term in tackling the imbalance that these countries have at the moment in their ability to engage with the world economy as it exists today, free up some of their own revenue to create a more sustainable infrastructure that will help feed through the next generation of children who can engage in the global economy, the type of economy we actually want to deal with. And we in the UK should be hugely proud of DFID, of our development institution, of our development ministry. Quite often, very simplistic arguments are levelled at it, you know, the Ethiopian Spice Girls and all of this nonsense. DFID is the government department in the UK that comes under the greatest amount of scrutiny by a very, very long way. It is the only UK government department where you can go online, see every grant they have made, analyse it line by line, and see where absolutely all the money goes, be that in direct or indirect existence through multilateral institutions. And it creates enormous change. On top of that, it's the envy of the rest of the world. I wouldn't know why we wouldn't want it. I was in the Financing for Development conference in Addis Ababa a couple of years ago at the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I was talking to one of my French colleagues. It was working in the French Foreign Ministry at the time. I'm Anglo-French. And he was asking why DFID was at the front of the queue for every talk with every African nation. Why, when all the trade talks that were going on in the sidelines of the Financing for Development conference, because just about every major nation was there, and they were talking to countries like Nigeria, Algeria, Ethiopia, countries that people want to trade with, why DFID always got to the front of the queue. And it's because France gives 0.3% of its economy to aid. It doesn't engage in any social way in these countries. It has a very elegant diplomatic corps. It has invariably some of the nicest embassies around the world, but it gets no traction because it pays for nothing. It is not a good corporate citizen. At the back of the queue of all these talks was the Italys, the Frances, the Spains, the ones that don't pay. At the front of the queue was the Britons, the Germanys, the USs, and the Scandinavians, the ones that do. It gives us huge international advantage in terms of our position, especially in emerging and developing nations. On top of that, UK charities and UK humanitarian organisations are amongst the most scrutinised in the world. Before I worked for UNICEF, I led a couple of large humanitarian organisations. And on average, because I've also worked in the commercial sector, when you run a commercial organisation, you get audited about once a year. Once a year, major Ernst & Young or someone like this comes through and looks through your books. On average, when I was running a major humanitarian organisation, I got audited between 40 and 60 times a year, because every single large government donor audits every single one of its contracts with every single one of its partners. And if you're receiving money from the British, the Swedish, the Norwegians, the Danish and the Americans, all of them audit you against all the things you're financing. So a lot of the accusations that are levelled at development operators, be them bilateral or multilateral, in terms of a lack of transparency and a lack of accountability are wrong. It provides more accountability, more transparency, and makes sure money is spent in a much better way. But finally, and I do have to emphasise on this one as well, it wouldn't be proper if I didn't, I believe we have a moral obligation to do this as well. We are the world's 5th largest economy. We are a very rich nation. We have some problems we need to tackle, but we're not talking about a great deal of money here. I'm going to quote a Conservative MP, Desmond Swain, and I'll do this to finish. He said that I don't know a single person in this world who spends more than 97.3% of their income on themselves. And to be frank, if I met one of them, I wouldn't want to know them. Thank you.
We'll take 3 questions at a time, I think. Please. You had your hand up first.
Just a point of interest in terms of the financing that we're providing UNICEF. Is that part of our general contribution to the UN, or is that a separate line item?
Yeah, if I can remember them, yeah.
Hi, projection of British soft power through international aid, great. Ideology spreading it, great. And I know you were very strong on kind of oversight there before, but my own experience, I spent a lot of time in Africa, is the twin evils of tribalism and corruption in Africa circumvent that pretty easily. How about we have a different approach? You maybe, if we're going to do a big aid project or build a dam or a road or irrigate, we engage a British company to work and guide the project, and we teach the locals probity and accountability. A lot of them do not get it. They feel that corruption is actually, it's part of the culture. You know, if there's something there, I'm going to take a bit of that. Well, let's teach them and do good, rather than just saying, there's the money, get on with it. We know we won't get an effective result otherwise.
Do you mind if I do 2 at a time rather than 3? Otherwise, I know I'm going to forget the first one. Budget, yes. We get revenue from multiple different sources. So the multilateral contributions we get is part of the core budget, comes out of DFID contributions, about 450 million a year. We also get other project contributions coming out. So we get certain things like aid match and things like this, which are other mechanisms. It's not core contributions. So, for example, we run a celebrity football match here in the UK. We put celebrities against professional footballers. It's all very entertaining, and every pound we raise from the UK public, the British government DFID matches. So there are other small incremental sort of things, but the majority of it is core contributions. We also raise about 110 million a year out of the UK public as well, in terms of emergency contributions and things like this. Yes and no. It depends how you do it. I'm not an advocate of what is quite frequently very, if I'm honest, arrogant and condescending aid, which is, we're going to come in and do this for you, and we're going to show you how to do it, because, yes, it has to come in a very broad brush way. So it has to be engagement with the government, where we help the government develop a bit infrastructure projects, education projects, and this is exactly what UNICEF does. We work with the government, where we bring our own technical expertise, where we focus on the skills transfer, and where we have total oversight on expenditure. Yes, there are a lot of vanity projects out there, and not all governments are as good as the UK in terms of how aid is applied. An awful lot will chuck money at a government and allow them to spend it as they see fit, and I'll be blunt, some of it ends up in Geneva and some of it ends up in places it shouldn't. But when you put it through established institutions like UNICEF or like DFID and how DFID applies aid, I can guarantee you it gets spent better than probably most commercial investment in Africa, I would say, because we bring technical expertise, we help build capacity in the country, we invest in the education that underpins it, and we work with the government to build the skills they need to make it sustainable in the long term. So what you're talking about, we do, but with certain provisos and caveats.
Hi, I was really struck by your positive message in contrast to the story that you get in the media, and particularly the link with our future trade. So what might be seen by some as a selfless, actually being a selfish act of giving, if that makes sense. Yeah. And I'm wondering what more that we can do to get that positive message out to the wider world.
Sorry, before. So I work for a think tank called the Project for Modern Democracy, and we've been doing research on the effectiveness of aid for the last 8 months or so. We're releasing a project at the end of the month, and our conclusion is very much in line with what you've been saying, that aid offers tremendous value for money and is very effective. I'd just like to mention the fact that inflows of aid of around roughly 5% of the income of a recipient country are correlated with about 1.5% annual growth, which is similar to that growth on which American prosperity has been based over the last 200 years. I just have two very short questions, which I wonder if you could ask. One is, what balance would you strike between bilateral and multilateral aid contributions? Should we be spending more aid as DFID, or should we be ramping up our contributions to the World Bank or through Gavi, etc.? And my other short question was, what are the things which you think aid does particularly well in contrast to, say, foreign direct investment or trade, that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Positive message. Yeah, I am very positive about where things are going because I think I've seen it for myself. I've seen how the difference that this type of thing can make. I've forgotten the second half of your question already, so why I'm asking for only two at a time. Yours I'll remember, definitely.
It was the positive message that you've given us.
Yeah.
How do we get that out to the world?
Okay. Yeah. It's good. If
why can't we just stop giving this money because it's a waste of...
If you've got an answer to that, please could you come and work with me? I don't. One of the biggest things we struggle with, we either have an element of the press that just wants to take us out, just wants to take us down. We have the sensationalist part that is only interested in either, square-jawed British heroes pulling puppies out of trees or taking out the aid industry. And that we're never going to change. I think it's a lot more, but we've got to put a lot of pressure or emphasis, I think, on ourselves. If I'm honest, the aid industry is incredibly bad at PR. We tend to talk to ourselves. We tend to not come to this type of event, but you'll find 101 tents around the Labour Party conference, all talking to ourselves and preaching to ourselves about these issues. And I think it's only by broadening the message, talking to a wider constituency, using exactly the evidence base that this gentleman here is bringing, and the economic argument, that we'll start to win it. Because it does, and to sort of segue into yours, couldn't agree more, it shows incredible impact when invested well. A great statistic I used at the launch of UNITLIFE, at the launch of the SDGs, was to African heads of state, where I said, I'm not going to ask you to spend more money on undernutrition because it's the right thing to do, because children are dying, because children are starving. You know that already. I'm going to do it because we can measure that it will have a 13% impact within 5 years on your GDP. You will bump your GDP by 13% within 5 to 8 years if you invest in undernutrition now, because you will have a healthier, better equipped to learn workforce coming through, and your productivity will go up. It's quite easy to measure. Now, in terms of bilateral, multilateral balance, it really depends on context. If you're asking me about Somalia, I'm going to tell you it's best through the multilateral system. Do not go through the bilateral system, other than for certain investments that helps the government incrementally grow its influence, because the actual way we're tackling most of the root cause issues is through direct engagement with civil society, because the government doesn't exist elsewhere. If it's to Nigeria, I would say it would probably be a balance between the two. I think they're getting it about right with Nigeria at the moment. Institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, they have a role to play in terms of strengthening the financial institutions underpinning the economy. Organisations like UNICEF have a role to play in a very broad brush way, from working in education through to strengthening the nutritional status, through to tackling some of the issues with Boko Haram and the peace and security issues in the north, and the displacement and the insecurity that's being caused there. And bilateral assistance with the government is strengthening the trade links that we have. It's, I think the Nigerian economy is estimated to have 43 billion in trade with the UK within the next few years. And strengthening those trade links and strengthening the institutions that can trade with us through all the ways I've just talked about makes very good economic sense in a country that is the fastest growing demographically and in terms of economies in Africa. And to finish on that stat, I think Africa is really worth focusing on, not just the middle income countries now, because Bill Gates projects that by 21 Africa will have overtaken Asia in terms of population based on current growth. And areas like West Africa, which are seeing the highest growth, also have the highest levels of climate change impact, desertification, economic imbalances. And unless we start tackling those now, by 2100, it's our grandchildren who will be inheriting some of the problems that we face.
Yep. Hi. You have actually already partially answered it in the previous question, but I was just wondering, because a number of the government or countries you're working with, the governments will be sort of quite untrustworthy, I would imagine, and I was encouraged to hear about the sort of auditing and the process that goes through, but then obviously raises the danger of, if they were going to spend their own money on a water pipe and then you come in, invest and say, we'll work with this on that with you and invest in it, then that money they would have spent on it, they could embezzle or whatever else. I suppose my question is, to what extent do you work with non-governmental social enterprises? Sort of what's the balance of that versus governmental work?
Again, depends on the context. In countries like Somalia, we'll work almost exclusively, other than through particular government strengthening things. At a grassroots level, we work through local institutions, especially in our humanitarian work. We do work with the government of Somalia, and actually the new elected government we work with very closely, helping to enhance supply chain and etc. But the balance is particularly towards civil society there, just because that's what constitutes most of our methods of engagement. In other countries, the Zambias, the Namibias, the emerging economies is almost exclusively through government. And we have a role that's far less operational and far more normative. So we'll help them introduce the standards they need, the training they need, and apply things. So really it depends on context, and you will go from the Syria 100% directly or applied or through civil society organizations through to the emerging economies where it's almost 100% with government. Thank you.